In recent years, graphics card prices have been on the rise, and finding anything remotely affordable has become out of the question. So what if I told you for the low price of $25 you could get a somewhat decent graphics card that could run almost anything? Sounds too good to be true, right? Well maybe, but in this video I'll try to prove otherwise. The card I am referring to is the GTX 960, which released a whopping 10 years ago, and it was targeted at the mid-range market, having an MSRP of $99. This is way cheaper than even an entry-level current GPU, and since it released it has only dropped further in price. Now they can be picked up on eBay for the median price of $25, with some entries and local listings being much cheaper. Now, what exactly do you get for that money? Well, not much. The card comes in a 4GB and 2GB variant, with 2GB seeming to compromise most of the market. It also comes with 1024 shading units, which is roughly 1/20th of what something like an RTX 5090 has, and no ray tracing of course. Despite these bleak specs however, it still performs surprisingly well, of which we will see in the upcoming benchmarks. Also, I want to mention a quick disclaimer. The framerate you see in the capture footage will often be lower than the framerate that I got when I was benchmarking it, as unfortunately I don't have a capture card, so I have to screen capture on the computer, which lowers the framerate some. With that in mind, please enjoy the upcoming benchmarks. I started things off with the standard potato game, Terraria. The card ran this flawlessly, maintaining a constant locked 60 frames per second. I decided to add a bunch of effects to try to stress things, but even then the game still ran at 60 FPS. Bumping things up a dimension to Minecraft, the game ran great, having an average of 370 frames per second at the default chunk limit of 12, with fancy graphics. I installed a shader and realistic texture pack, which lowered the frame rate, but it was still very playable at around 60 to 70 frames per second depending on the environment. With this card, any older Valve game will also run great. I decided to use Portal 2 as an example here, which pretty much always stayed around 200 FPS, with occasional drops down to 150 FPS. This was with the settings completely maxed out, and every single graphics option set to the highest value possible. The game looked incredible and much sharper than any modern title. Another game I wanted to test was Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, although it unfortunately wouldn't launch on my system, so I wasn't able to test it. However, I can confidently say that it would run extremely well, as I used to play this on a GTX 650 without any issues at all. Moving on to the newer indie suite, I fired up the latest and greatest hit, Peak. This ran pretty decently, although the settings had to be lowered to a mixture of medium and low in order to achieve 60 frames per second. The game still looked decent however, and even in the other environments the framerate remained the same. Another fun group game to play is Repo, which ran fine on the card with max settings. In most maps, the framerate averaged around 110 FPS, with some fluctuation depending on what was happening. For example, these cooking frogs started fighting each other, which caused some dips into the high 90s. Modern 2D games are still a piece of cake for this card. Bolero ran at a constant capped 75 frames per second, and barely utilized the card at all. There are also virtually no stutters, with the frame time graph remaining nearly completely flat. Perhaps the newest and most hyped indie game, Silksong, ran incredibly on the card, averaging in the mid to high 400s. This was with the settings on the highest values, although I didn't test it in any boss battles, where lots of particle effects could potentially have an impact on the frame rate. Next, I tried out some easy to run esports titles. CSGO ran and looked great on medium settings, averaging around 100 FPS, with a lobby full of bots on the Anubis map. If desiring a more competitive experience, the settings could be lowered to the low preset, which yielded an average of 150. Fortnite was a much more demanding title, although I can't tell how much of the performance issues I had were due to the graphics card or my processor. On medium settings with a near draw distance, the game averaged 80 frames per second, but often had stutters that were anywhere from a small hitch to completely freezing the game for a few seconds. As mentioned before though, this probably wasn't a fault of the graphics card. When lowering things to performance mode, most of the stutters went away, and the frame rate nearly doubled to an average of 160 FPS, which is great for more competitive players who want every frame they can get, even if it means less graphical fidelity. Speaking of competitive players, Valorant ran amazingly on all settings, getting an average of 300 FPS on low settings, and a more visually pleasing but lower 250 FPS on medium settings. This should be fine for the majority of players, except maybe those playing on 360Hz or 540Hz monitors, where every extra frame gives an advantage. Overwatch 2 also looked and ran very well on a mixture of medium and high settings, yielding around 90 FPS on average, although this fluctuated a lot depending on how many characters were fighting on screen. Despite this, it never went below the 80s, and there were no stutters unlike Fortnite. In the final round of benchmarks, I tried out some of the latest and greatest most demanding titles to push the card to the limit. The first game I tried was the finals, which ran surprisingly well, albeit with all low settings and some mild FSR, running at an internal resolution of 900p. The game did look pretty smudgy, and there were fair amounts of stutters, but this was mainly due to recording. When I wasn't capturing benchmark footage, the game ran pretty smoothly with an average FPS of roughly 60. It also was decently fun to play, and I was able to get some nice combo kills. Upon initially launching Expedition 33, the game ran completely horribly, getting a meager 16 FPS on just the title screen. This also carried over to gameplay, where the frame rate was often in the low tens to single digits. Just have a look here at part of the intro sequence.
If you're gonna give someone flowers, you should probably do it before they wither and die.
What, the flower? Or Sophie?
Ooh, dark.
After a lot, and I mean a lot, of tweaking the settings though, I was able to get the game surprisingly playable. Going with a combination of low settings and performance FSR, the frame rate improved to an average of 40 FPS, which stayed consistent during both battles and open world sequences. It didn't look that great however, so this might be one of the games to wait to buy until after you have a better graphics card. Any game with hardware required ray tracing simply won't run at all. Luckily, there are only 2 games currently out on the market with this requirement. Both Indiana Jones and The Great Circle and Doom the Dark Ages will fail to launch with an error message mentioning a need for RTX compatibility. Even if they did launch, they would probably be filled with issues or poor performance as most of the game is based on RTX Global Illumination. The final game on this list is the new Battlefield 6, which will soon be releasing this October. While I missed the open beta and cannot test the game now, I was able to find some online benchmarks of the card, which seemed to run at about 30 FPS on 1080p low. While this is just a guess, you could probably get closer to 60 FPS by using some upscaling or rendering the game at 720p or even 640p in a pinch. This wouldn't look very good, but would enable enough of a frame rate to at least have a chance of being competitive in some casual matches. While this card certainly suffers some in the way of graphical fidelity and performance in some of the more modern titles, it can still run the majority of older games, indie games, and light esports titles fine, and provided you don't mind lowering the settings down greatly on modern titles, it can even run some of those at close to 60 FPS, even if it does end up looking like a blurry smear. This card definitely isn't for everyone, but for those on a tight budget, or who are trying out PC gaming and looking for a cheap entry-level card, or even those who find themselves primarily playing on older or easier to run titles, this card excels in those things, and finding both a graphically pleasing and smooth experience is entirely possible. And besides, for the price of 25 bucks, it's hard to be too harsh on the card. Given how old and seemingly hated it has become virtually forgotten, which has led to the such low prices online. Even though it has the same performance as a 1050 Ti, it is around 1/3 the price, and it is pretty much at the bottom of the market as anything cheaper is much, much worse. So anyway, if you're one of the groups of people I mentioned earlier, consider picking up this card if you don't want to drop hundreds of dollars on a new GPU. And please tell me your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. Is this good value for money or just another obsolete product that belongs in the waste bin? So with that, have a wonderful day, good luck with your graphical purchases, and I'll see you in the next video whenever that comes out.